Tonight we welcome Professor Robert George, a distinguished professor of political thought. Robert P. George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence, a title actually once held by Woodrow Wilson, among others, and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's author of some 15 books, including Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, In Defense of Natural Law, relating to his talk tonight, and the Clash of Orthodoxies. Professor George serves on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's a former member of the President's Council on Bioethics and also previously served as a presidential appointee on the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He also served on UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Science and Technology. He is a recipient of many honors and awards, including the Presidential Citizens Medal, Honorific Medal for the Defense of Human Rights of the Republic of Poland, and the Canterbury Medal of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, the Sidney Hook Memorial Award of the National Association of Scholars, the Philip Merrill Award of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, the Bradley Prize for Intellectual and Civic Engagement, and the Stanley Kelly Jr. Teaching Award from Princeton's Department of Politics. He's also, interestingly, a banjo player and a guitarist. This evening's talk is one of the Deichmann family lectures on religion and modernity, and we're quite grateful to John Deichmann of the class of 1970 for making this possible. I've asked Professor George to make the case tonight for natural law and why anyone should believe in it today. His talk is titled Natural Law, God, and Human Dignity. Please join me in welcoming Professor George.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much, Professor Landy, and thanks to all of you for coming out, especially on this cold evening. Thanks for weathering the cold to be with me. It's really a great honor to be lecturing in this series, and I want to say that I'm thankful and grateful to the Deichmann family for making my visit and the visit of so many others possible. It's wonderful to be back at Holy Cross. I've been here before, but it's been a number of years. It's great to make new friends like Tom. And to visit some old friends and renew some old friendships. David Schaefer, Professor David Schaefer, Malik Neal, Kevin Spinelli, SJ. It's really just a marvelous opportunity to renew those cherished friendships. Well, why should you believe in natural law? You do believe in natural law, whether you know it or not. But why should you? Well, let's begin at the beginning with the most foundational and fundamental principles of natural law. Those principles that direct our choices and action toward what is intelligibly choice-worthy, what gives us reasons for action, and away from the privations of those human goods, those aspects of our well-being and fulfillment as human beings. So if I'm right, if there's truth to the natural law position, it's because there is a human good. Or more precisely, there are human goods. Because the human good is variegated. There's not just this one thing, the human good. There are many diverse, irreducible aspects of our well-being and fulfillment as human beings. Many human goods. Now, this is not to deny that human nature is determinate. In affirming that the human good is variegated, there are many basic human goods, providing many more than merely instrumental reasons for our choices and actions. I'm not denying that there's a determinate human nature, like every other natural law theorist, and lots of people who are not natural law theorists. Even my Princeton colleague, Peter Singer, who is certainly not a natural law theorist. I believe that human nature is determinate. My point is not that it is anything other than determinate. Rather, my point is that it is complex. Consider some of the complexity that we know about ourselves, us human creatures. Well, first of all, we're animals, right? But rational. Our good, our integral good, includes our biological health and well-being. We are, after all, animals. We are organisms. We can flourish or fail to flourish. We can decline if we fail to flourish in terms of our physical health. In that way, we're like alligators and rats and potatoes. We can flourish or fail to flourish in that dimension as organisms. But we can also flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our intellectual well-being. We can be attentive, sharp, inquisitive, careful in our thinking, critical in our examination of a subject, judicious in our judgments. We can flourish intellectually. Or we can decline or fail to flourish intellectually. We can be inattentive, mindless, kind of stupid, careless in our thinking, prepared to believe the next thing we hear from some friend passing along some gossip, or next thing we read in the newspaper or whatever. And we can tell the difference between the two. So just as we can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our biological health, we can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our intellectual well-being. So there's some complexity just for starters. We're animals, but rational. Our integral good includes our bodily well-being, but also our intellectual well-being. And with it, our moral well-being. After all, we can be other-directed, compassionate, kind, principled, ready to follow our duty, serious about understanding what our duty is, or we can be monsters. We can be Mother Teresa or Adolf Hitler, and we can tell the difference between the two. We know what the difference is between flourishing in terms of our character, being a person of good character, and being a person of bad character. So there's another dimension of complexity. Just as we can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our physical well-being and our intellectual well-being, the same is true in respect of our moral well-being or our character. And the same is true, I dare say, at least religious believers believe, with respect to our spiritual well-being. We can have a rich, robust interior life, or we can be spiritually vacuous. But that's still not all that's to be said about the complexity of the human good, reflecting the complexity of our makeup as human beings. Because consider that although we are individuals, we come packaged as individual organisms, an aspect of our fulfillment as human beings, an irreducible dimension of our fulfillment as human beings, is in terms of our sociability. So friendship and other forms of association are valuable to us. They enrich our lives, not merely as means to other ends, but as ends in themselves for us. And so we enter into relationships, associations with each other, not merely to advance our individualistic goals more efficiently by combining, the way business partners might, with no moral wrong being done. But that's not really a friendship when it's just a business partnership for each party to achieve more efficiently their individualistic goals. No, we're capable of entering into friendships, relationships for non-instrumental reasons. That is, for the sake of the friendships themselves, considered as fulfillments of our humanity, considered as aspects of our integral well-being, our flourishing. So we form bonds with others not merely for instrumental purposes, but because of our grasp of the inherent fulfillments available in joining together in a wide variety of informal as well as formal types of association and community. Friendships, religious communities, civic associations, and so forth. Now, by reflecting on the various goods of human nature, especially those most immediately pertaining to social and political life, now to narrow the field a bit, natural law theorists propose to arrive at a sound understanding of principles of justice, including those principles of justice that we give a special name to. Those principles of justice we call human rights. Now, natural law theorists typically, and I believe rightly, reject two extremes. One we might call strict or radical individualism, the viewpoint that is associated, for example, with the writings of Ayn Rand on the one side, and collectivism in its most dramatic and extensive forms, the Soviet communist system, for example, on the other hand. Individualism of the extreme sort, the radical sort, tends to overlook the intrinsic value of human sociability and to view human beings atomistically. It reduces all forms of human association to the instrumental value that they possess, thus overlooking the intrinsic value of human friendships and other forms of relationship. It tends to view associations as worthwhile, to be sure, but worthwhile only as means of advancing the individual goals of the individual participants in the collectivity, something as small as a friendship or large as a political community. Collectivism, at the other extreme, compromises the dignity of human beings by tending to instrumentalize and subordinate their well-being to the interests of larger social units. The state, the Volk, the Führer, the future communist utopia, whatever it is. It reduces the human person to the status of a mere cog in a larger social wheel whose well-being, whose flourishing is merely a means rather than an end to which other things are means. As someone who can be sacrificed, whose interest in well-being can simply be sacrificed for the sake of some alleged greater good of the Volk or the state or the Führer or the future communist utopia. The human person, who should be treated as the end to which systems, economic, political, social, are means, is instead treated as a mere means to the flourishing or well-being of the larger collectivity, the system. Now, individualists and collectivists, and here, of course, I'm referring to the extreme positions. The trouble with using terms like individualist or collectivist or liberal or conservative is that they mean different things to different people and mean different things in different contexts and mean different things at different historical periods. So I'm trying to describe with a bit more specificity what I mean by these things. So I'm talking about the more extreme versions of these views. Individualists and collectivists both have theories of justice and human rights. And in some cases, they're quite interesting. I mean, the radical libertarian theory of justice is, to me, a very interesting theory. I think it's dead wrong. But it's a very interesting theory, and serious people have put serious thought into it. The same on the collectivist side. My friend Professor Schaefer will remember a time when the big debate in political theory, or a big debate in political theory, was about whether Marxism had a theory of justice. On one side were those who said, oh no, it's just a scientific, external, descriptive account of how things work in the world, how the great dialectic of history works, leading ultimately to the establishment after the revolution of the great communist utopia. But there were others who said, no, there's a normative component of Marxism. There's a Marxist theory of human rights, and they tried to adumbrate one, and these were serious people making serious art. Again, I think that wrong, but making serious arguments. So I don't think they can simply be dismissed. They have to be argued against. If I were giving a lecture devoted to making the argument against them, I would spell out what I can here only give you a sketch of. I think the common mistake of the radical individualists and the collectivists is that they misunderstand the key concept of the human person. Thus, their errors are rooted in important misunderstandings of human nature and the human good. Neither can do justice to the concept of a human person, that is, a rational animal, as Aristotle rightly said, who is a locus of intrinsic value and as such an end in himself, who may never legitimately be treated, as the collectivists would treat him, as a mere means to other ends, but whose well-being intrinsically includes relationships with others and membership in formal and informal communities in which he or she has, as a matter of justice, both rights and ordinarily responsibilities. I say ordinarily responsibilities because, of course, there are some human beings who have rights although they have no responsibilities. Human beings who are too young, for example, to have responsibilities. Still have rights, but they are too young to have responsibilities. Others may be suffering from severe mental disabilities. They don't have responsibilities, but they still have rights that should be respected. But I think if we can get this concept of the human person correctly, we can understand that correctly, we can understand the integral good of the human person, then we're going to be able to avoid the errors of both individualism and collectivism. Now, there are human rights. It's very popular today to talk in the language of human rights. Everybody claims they're for human rights. Have you ever met anybody who says, I'm against human rights? Everybody says they're for human rights. What I get a kick out of is my students who claim to be moral relativists, but they're for human rights. Well, let's try to be a little more rigorous about human rights. There are human rights if there are principles of practical reason directing us to act or abstain from acting in certain ways out of respect for the well-being, the fulfillment, and thus the dignity of persons whose legitimate interests may be affected by what we do. I think we're going to talk seriously about human rights. It's got to be something like that understanding of what human rights are and the conditions under which we are reasonable in affirming that human rights exist or obtain. Now, I certainly believe that there are such principles, so I believe in human rights, and I believe that they're principles of justice. And if there are such principles, they cannot be overridden by considerations of social utility. People's rights have to be respected, even when it's inconvenient for the larger collectivity to respect their rights. That's why we're opposed, we should be opposed, to killing innocent people, even for the sake of important social goals, even if for the sake of saving a lot of other innocent people. So a complete defense of any account of natural law and natural rights would have to include a telling critique of utilitarian and other consequentialist or aggregative accounts of moral reasoning. Here there's a real challenge to the natural law position from the utilitarian, or more broadly speaking, consequentialist position, who believes that considerations of utility in the end are what determine morally upright from morally wrongful action, and at the end of the day an act is justified if it's justified by utilitarian considerations. I'll say a word later on about why I think the utilitarian system simply cannot work. But it's the real challenger at this level to the natural law position on the existence of human rights. But if there are human rights, at a very general level, they are principles that direct us now. I'm speaking generally, trying to comprehend all of the legitimate claims of human rights. They direct us, in Kant's famous phrase, to treat humanity always as an end and never as a means only. The way Kant formulated that particular version of the categorical imperative was to treat humanity, whether in the person of yourself or another. It's not simply other regarding, even yourself. Treat humanity, whether in the person of yourself or another, always as an end and never as a means only. Human beings are persons. They're not things. They have dignity in virtue of being persons. They are not to be reduced to the status of instruments, objects, property. That's what human rights are all about. It's about not treating people as mere means, giving them their due as persons. Now, although we need not put the matter in terms of rights, it's perfectly reasonable and I believe helpful to speak of a right against, for example, just to take an uncontroversial example today, although it was a time when it was controversial, it's reasonable, helpful to speak of a right against being enslaved, and to speak of slavery as a violation of human rights. Some people don't like to talk in terms of rights. The British political theorist Joan Lockwood O'Donovan, for example, thinks that the minute you start talking in terms of human rights, you're already buying into an individualist, libertarian understanding of morality, which begins to legitimate selfishness and to obscure our corporate responsibilities, our duties to each other. Now, I don't agree with her about that. Now, having said that, and having said that I think that the language of human rights is a legitimate and helpful way of conceiving moral obligations pertaining to justice, I want to say that it is true that the language of human rights is often abused. It's all too common for people to identify human rights with anybody's claim to anything, or to imagine that I have a right to something because I want it. And as Mary Ann Glendon in her wonderful book, Rights Talk, pointed out, it devalues and debases the language of human rights when we focus so single-mindedly on rights that we forget about their correlatives, namely duties, responsibilities. And it is true, I think, in our culture, and not just in the academic setting, but more broadly, that people tend to be focused so much on the idea of claims of rights that they forget about responsibilities. Still, having said that, I think that the language of human rights can be useful in articulating moral truths, and that's why I'm not following O'Donovan in abstaining from the use of the language of rights altogether. So take, for example, this right against being enslaved. This idea of slavery is a violation of human rights. It's a moral right that people have, one that every community is morally obliged to protect by law, and it's a right that they have not by virtue of being members of a certain sex or race or class or ethnic group, but simply in virtue of one's humanity. That's what it means to be a human right. Now, by this phrase, one's humanity, I mean to refer more precisely to the nature of human beings as rational creatures, that is, as persons. The nature of human beings is a rational nature, and therefore an open-ended nature, one not an indeterminate one, but a nature that is free. We make free choices. So, in virtue of our human nature, we human beings possess a profound and inherent dignity. The same would be true, however, of beings other than human beings, whose nature is a rational nature. It would be true of them as well, if indeed there are such beings. So if there really were a being like E.T., if one showed up tomorrow, that being, as a person, that is, as a creature bearing a rational nature, would have human rights. Now, in the case of humans, even individuals who have not yet acquired the immediately exercisable capacities for conceptual thought and other rational acts, and even those who have temporarily or permanently lost them, like people suffering from severe dementias or children who are severely mentally handicapped, or older people or anybody who's severely mentally handicapped, and indeed even those who never possess them and never will, possess a rational nature. And it's in virtue of their rational nature that we rightly accord them the dignity of persons and treat them not as means or instruments or objects, but as ends. This is why we don't look at a severely mentally handicapped child and say, that's not a person. That is a collection of transplantable organs. We could take a heart, 2 kidneys, a liver, and so forth, and we could save maybe 11 people who are waiting for organ transplants. Why do we not do that? Because we recognize their dignity as rational creatures, even though they lack the immediately exercisable capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice. They still possess them in root or radical form. If they were somehow to be made whole in respect of those abilities by a miracle or perhaps some new medical technology, they would be perfected as the kinds of beings they are. They wouldn't be turned into other kinds of beings. It wouldn't be like a talking horse. You would be perfecting that being as the kind of being he or she is, namely a human being, a rational being, a being possessing a rational nature. Now, in addition to our negative duties, like don't enslave people, and their corresponding rights, like the right not to be enslaved, we obviously have certain positive duties. Duties, for example, to, at the moral level, this isn't necessarily true at the legal level, but imagine at the moral level, wouldn't we all agree that if you're walking past a little fountain with water in it, a couple of feet of water, and you happen to notice that there's a little baby in the pool, the little fountain of water, drowning, and you can easily reach in and pull the baby out without any risk to yourself, well, I think we would all agree you have a moral duty, a positive obligation to rescue the baby. It wouldn't be enough to say, I didn't put the baby in there, so I can just walk by and let the baby drown. And that shows that in addition to our negative duties, don't put babies in pools and let them drown, we have positive duties. Sometimes we need to interrupt our lives to do a good deed, to do unto others as we'd have them do unto us. And these positive duties, too, can be articulated and discussed in the language of rights, though here it's especially important that we be clear about by whom and how a given right is supposed to be honored. Now, sometimes it's said, for example, that education or health care is a right. People talk that way all the time. You hear this in public debate constantly. It's not a privilege, it's not an option, it's a right. Now, it's not necessarily unreasonable to speak this way, but much more needs to be said if it's to be a meaningful statement. Lay aside whether it's a true statement. Much more needs to be said if it's to be a meaningful statement. We can't simply be content to toss around, especially when it comes to positive duties and their correlative rights, the language of such and so is a right. Education is a right. Healthcare is a right. Recreation is a right. Because we have to ask such questions as, who is supposed to provide healthcare or education or recreation to whom? Why should those persons or those institutions be the providers rather than other persons or other institutions? What place should the provision of education or healthcare or recreation occupy on the list of social and political priorities? If we have in the community the resources to build a library or build a swimming pool or build a clinic, how do we decide? If we don't have the resources for all three, how do we decide whether the priority should be given to health, the clinic, education, the library, recreation, the pool, the swimming pool? Is it better for education and healthcare to be provided by governments under socialized systems, which is often what people mean, I think, when they say education or healthcare is a right, or by private providers in markets, or by some combination, and if so, what combination of government involvement and the market? Now notice, and this is the key thing I want you to notice here, these questions go beyond the application of moral principles. You cannot resolve them simply by invoking a moral principle, even a correct moral principle. They will still leave the matter underdetermined, unsettled. They require technical, for example, economic, sometimes psychological or sociological, and prudential judgments, including judgments of the sort that can vary depending on contingent circumstances that people face in a given society at a given point in time. There isn't some timeless, always uniquely correct answer for what we should do about education or healthcare or recreation. The answer to each question can lead to further questions, and the problems can be extremely complex, far more complex than the issue of slavery, for example, where once a right has been identified and its universality and the basic terms of its application, once a right has been identified, its universality and the basic terms of its application are fairly clear. Everybody has a moral right not to be enslaved, and everybody has an obligation as a matter of strict justice to refrain from enslaving others. Governments have a moral obligation to respect and protect the right and correspondingly to enforce the obligation. Now, one basic human right that almost all natural law theorists and many other people affirm is the right of an innocent person not to be directly killed or maimed, including by torture. This is a right that's violated when someone makes the death or injury of another person the precise object of his act, whether it is the ultimate end or approximate end, where the death or injury is inflicted as a means, deliberately intended means, to getting something else. It's this right that grounds the norm against targeting non-combatants, even in justified wars, and against abortion, euthanasia, and other forms of deliberate homicide. Now, the natural law understanding of human rights I'm here sketching is connected with a particular account of human dignity, and I owe it to you to tell you what that is so that you can evaluate it for yourself. Under this account, the natural human capacities for reason and freedom, deliberation, judgment, and choice, are fundamental to the dignity of human beings, the dignity that is protected by human rights. I've hinted at this already. Now I'm just going to come completely out and say it. The basic goods of human nature, those fundamental aspects of our well-being and fulfillment that provide our most basic reasons for action, those reasons that require no further or deeper reasons for their intelligibility, those basic human goods are the goods of a rational creature, a creature who, unless impaired or prevented from doing so, naturally develops and exercises those capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice. Now, these capacities, I want to put to you, are God-like, albeit in a limited way, of course. In fact, from the theological vantage point, they constitute a certain sharing, limited to be sure, but real, in divine power. This is what is meant, I believe, by the otherwise extraordinarily puzzling biblical teaching that man is made in the very image and likeness of God. I mean, after all, what could that passage in Genesis mean? Man is made in the image and likeness of God. It can't mean that, God has 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose, right? That can't be how we're made in the God-likeness about us. No. As the greatest of Jewish and Christian thinkers have held, what it must mean is that, like God, we are capable of acting freely on reasons. We're capable of causing states of affairs that we are not ourselves caused to cause. We have those powers of deliberation, judgment, and choice. We transcend the domain of causality. We're in it. We're physical. We're organisms. But we're capable of transcending it. But whether or not one recognizes biblical authority or even believes in a personal God, it's true and can be known to be true. And it's our most immediate experience that human beings really do possess a power traditionally ascribed to divinity, namely the quite literally awesome, awe-inspiring power to cause things that one is not oneself caused to cause. So I'm not, as it happens, I am a theist, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, but nothing in my argument depends on God's existing. The argument depends on believing what I think is obvious, that we actually do have a power traditionally ascribed to divinity, the power of rationality and of freedom, the power to cause things we're not caused to cause. And even an atheist, and there are many atheists, who do believe that we have those literally godlike powers. They would give a different account of where they come from than a theist would. A theist would say, we have them as gifts from God. They're a sharing in divine power. An atheist who nevertheless recognized the reality of our rational powers would say, we created God in our image and likeness. What's special about us and makes us different from all the other terrestrial creatures we know about, we have now invested in this idea of a divine being who gave us this power. But whichever way you go, you can acknowledge and should acknowledge that we have those literally godlike powers. And it seems to me it's the possession of those, it's our rational nature as creatures who are oriented toward the exercise of precisely those powers that are at the ground of our dignity. Those powers truly are awesome. What exactly is this power to cause what one is not caused to cause, to be godlike? Well, it's the power to envisage a certain state of affairs that does not now exist, to grasp the value of bringing it into being, and then to act by choice and not merely by impulse or instinct like a brute animal, like a cow or a gecko or a grizzly bear, to bring that state of affairs into being. Now, that state of affairs may be anything from the development of an intellectual skill, crossword puzzle, chess, or the attainment of an item of knowledge, trying to understand the causes of the First World War, or the periodic table of elements, to the creation or critical appreciation of a work of art. It might not be Michelangelo, but some effort to represent reality in a way that is interesting and possibly even beautiful, to the establishments of various kinds of interpersonal relationships, friendships, a marriage, a religious community. The moral or cultural significance of whatever that state of affairs is may be great or far more commonly comparatively minor. What matters for the point I'm now making is that it's a product of human reason and freedom. It is the fruit of deliberation, judgment, and choice, the exercise of those awesome powers that we creatures have, human creatures have. Now, we may, if we like, consider as a further matter whether beings capable of such powers could exist apart from a divine source and ground of their being. That's the theism question. And I certainly think this is a question that each of us has a strict moral obligation to ponder. But whatever one's conclusion, whether one comes out on the theistic side or the atheistic side, I don't think it makes sense to say that beings whose nature is to develop and exercise reason and freedom are lacking in dignity and rights and may therefore be treated as mere objects, instruments, or property. And that should be common ground, regardless of what one's religion is or if one even has a religion. My colleague in religious ethics at Princeton, Jeffrey Stout, is not a believer, not a religious believer. He's a self-identified atheist. But he believes just as much as I do in human rights. He believes just as much as I do that human rights are grounded in the dignity of the human being as a rational creature. He believes that human beings really do exercise godlike powers, or the powers traditionally ascribed to divinity, although he doesn't believe that the way to account for those powers is by reference to a supernatural being or a supreme being or God. So we disagree on the theism question, but that doesn't generate any difference of opinion between the two of us when it comes to the basis of the human good and our moral obligations, the dignity of human beings. And the same is true, I'm sure, for many atheists that you know. People sometimes ask, how can atheists be morally good people? It's because they can understand natural law, too. They can understand what the basic elements of human well-being fulfillment are, and they can understand what follows from them by way of their integral directiveness or prescriptivity. They can affirm, as Jeffrey Stout affirms, the dignity of the human being. Or think of the great Matt Hentoff, another self-described atheist. I don't know if you read Matt's jazz criticism on the Village Voice or his civil libertarians, Nat Hentoff's civil libertarian writings. But here is a great moralist who is not a believer. But he's not left in the position of believing that since there is no God, human beings have no dignity. He still understands that human beings mysteriously possess dignity in virtue of these powers of reason and freedom that somehow we have. Now, what about the authority for this view of human nature, the human good, human dignity, and human rights? You're probably wondering, okay, George, what's the authority for this view? Where are you getting all this? Well, natural law theorists are interested in the intelligible reasons people have for their choices and actions. We're particularly interested in reasons that can be identified without appeal to any authority apart from the authority of reason itself. This is not to deny that it's often perfectly reasonable to recognize and submit to religious or secular authority, like legal authority, in deciding what to do and not do. So being a natural law theorist doesn't mean that you reject the legitimacy of any authority except the authority of reason itself. No. Natural law theorists characteristically believe that there are often good grounds for respecting authority, but you need reasons justifying the authority. Indeed, natural law theorists such as the late Yves Simone of the University of Chicago, or Elizabeth Anscombe at Cambridge, my own teacher John Finnis at Oxford, have made important contributions to understanding why and how people can sometimes be morally bound, that is, have conclusive reasons to submit to and be guided in their action by authority of various types. But even here, the special concern of the natural law theorist is with the reasons people have for recognizing and honoring claims to authority. We do not simply appeal to authority to justify authority. That would be, on the natural law account, an illegitimate move. If there is legitimate authority, there's got to be an account, a rational account of the basis of that authority, why it's legitimate. One might then ask whether human beings are in fact rational. Everything I've been arguing presupposes that we are. Our dignity is rooted in our rational natures, that is, our natures as creatures who are capable of reason and freedom. But is it true? It's something that many atheists, as well as most theists, believe, but is it true? Can we discern any intelligible reasons for our choices and actions? Well, everybody recognizes that some ends or purposes pursued through human action are intelligible, at least insofar as they provide means to other ends. For example, people work to earn money, and their doing so is perfectly rational, even though nobody would want money just for its own sake. Or if you did want money just for its own sake, we'd begin to worry about you. You'd be fetishizing little green paper or pieces of metal or something like that. No. Why do people want money? For other reasons, for instrumental reasons, because you can buy stuff with it, or the prestige that attaches to it, or you can put some away for a rainy day in case you need it down the line. Money is a valuable means to a great many ends, and no one doubts its instrumental value. So even skeptics do not deny that there are instrumental goods. The question is whether some ends or purposes are intelligible as providing more than merely instrumental reasons for acting. Are there, in other words, intrinsic as well as instrumental human goods? What skeptics deny is that there are intelligible ends or purposes that make possible rationally motivated action. Natural law theorists, by contrast, hold that friendship, knowledge, virtue itself, aesthetic appreciation, and certain other ends or purposes are intrinsically valuable. They're intelligibly choice-worthy not simply as means to other ends, but as ends in themselves. So we argue it's not baffling that someone would read Shakespeare, spend some time with the plays or the sonnets, not because they're trying to get a job in an English literature department, which they might or might not be doing, not because they want to impress people at cocktail parties, not because they're interested in going on to a TV show like Jeopardy and they might ask a Shakespeare question, but simply for the intrinsic enrichment that's on offer in engaging with a mind as wonderful as Shakespeare. That's not baffling. And if that's not baffling, if you think that's not baffling, as I think that's not baffling, then you see the intelligible point of pursuing some sorts of knowledge, at least, just for its own sake. You've understood the good of knowledge as an intrinsic and not merely instrumental human good. You've grasped knowledge as an aspect of the integral fulfillment or well-being of human beings. The same with friendship. Let's say we learn that Tom here spent last night visiting a friend in the hospital. The friend was so woozy from the narcotic painkillers. He's in bad shape, this friend. So woozy from the narcotic painkillers that he was just coming in and out of consciousness, maybe even barely aware that Tom is in the room. But Tom went there not because he was trying to get in on the will. I don't know if you're a married man, Tom, but not to impress the cute sister, but simply to be with his friend as an act of solidarity. Is that baffling? Are we left scratching our heads? The way we would be left scratching our heads if for the next half hour I just stood here and did this? That would be baffling. If I weren't doing it to make a philosophical point, believe me, you'd be sending for the guys with the white coats. But we're not sending for the guys with the white coats for Tom because he spent the evening with a friend in the hospital. Because we can understand the point of friendship as an aspect of our well-being and fulfillment. Which is not to say that we've answered any moral question simply by identifying knowledge or friendship as a human good, a more than merely instrumental reason for acting. Because after all, you can do bad things precisely for the sake of human goods. So now let's say that Malik does something that I'm sure he would never do because he's a good guy. Let's say that something much more likely, I did something disgraceful. And Malik is my friend, and he found out that I did it, and he knows that it's true. What's something, from a professor's point of view, let's say I embezzled from my research account. It's about the worst thing a professor can do. Okay, it's a really disgraceful thing. Malik learns that I did it. Okay? Now, the rumor starts going around, George has done this disgraceful thing. He embezzled from his research account. Another friend comes up to Malik and says, Malik, is it true that George, this guy who puts himself forward as this great moralist, always preaching morality, did this disgraceful thing? And now let's say Malik, out of friendship for me, to protect my reputation, gives into temptation out of affection and says, no, it's not true. I know the whole story. That's just a slander that's been put about by his political enemies to discredit him. Now, what Malik would have done in that case would be morally bad. Wouldn't be right, wouldn't be justified, he shouldn't do it. But is it intelligible? Or are we left scratching our heads the way we would be if I did this for a half hour? No, it's not baffling. It's not puzzling. We see the point, even though he did something bad to advance. It can do bad things for good reasons all the time, right? That's why we have the teaching. The end doesn't justify the means. But the end really is a good end. And what this illustrates is that we really do, because we're not baffled, whether it's a good thing like Tom did visiting his friend, or the bad thing like Malik did telling a lie to protect my reputation, we still either way grasp the intelligible point of an action motivated by friendship. So, such choices are intelligibly choice-worthy, not merely as means to other ends, but as ends in themselves. They cannot be reduced to, nor can their intelligible appeal be accounted for exclusively in terms of emotion or feeling or desire or other sub-rational motivating factors. These human goods, these basic human goods, friendship, knowledge, virtue, critical aesthetic appreciation, the development of skills, and so forth, are constitutive aspects of the well-being and fulfillment of human persons and the communities that we form, and they thereby provide the foundations of moral judgments, including our judgments pertaining to justice and human rights. Now, of course, there are plenty of people today who embrace philosophical or ideological doctrines that deny the human capacities I maintain are at the core of human dignity. They adopt a purely instrumental and essentially non-cognitivist view of practical reason, the view famously articulated by the 18th century British philosopher David Hume when he said that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and may never pretend to any office other than to serve and obey them. It's that instrumental view of human action that is now so dominant in some sectors of the culture, even though sometimes it's not held as a formal philosophical doctrine. It's just implicit in the way people think. And people who think that, especially those who do adopt it as a formal philosophical position, will argue that the human experience of deliberation, judgment, and choice is illusory. I was meeting with some students earlier this afternoon and telling the story of my old friend from New College, Oxford, where I was a lecturer at the beginning of my career, Richard Dawkins, who says that, look, of course I live my life every day not only acting as if I believe, but believing, in a certain sense, that I'm truly making choices and acting for reasons, and it's not all just determined by material forces. I'm like you. I live my life that way. But then I step back from the armchair and I look at it and I realize, he says realize, that actually these are just illusions. I thought I was freely choosing. I thought I was acting on reasons. But of course it was all reducible to efficient and material causes. The ends people pursue, people like Dawkins insist, are ultimately given by non-rational motivating factors such as feeling or emotion or desire. Thomas Hobbes, the great English political philosopher, articulated even earlier than Hume this same basic idea about the instrumental nature of practical reason when he said that the thoughts are to the desires, the thoughts, the mind, the intellect are to the desires, as scouts and spies to range abroad and find the way to the thing desired. The instrumental view of practical reason. On this account, truly rationally motivated action is impossible for creatures like us. There are no more than merely instrumental reasons for action, no basic human goods. So my belief in the dignity of the human being as the possessor of a rational nature, as a creature capable of deliberation and judgment and choice, just is rejected. Now, if proponents of this non-cognitivist and subjectivist view of human action are right, then they should reject the natural law view, and they should also reject with it the entire business of ethics. They should treat the whole thing as a charade, and they should treat human dignity as just a myth. But I don't think they are right. Indeed, I don't think they can give any account of the norms of rationality to which they themselves must appeal in attempting to make a case against reason and freedom that is consistent with the denial that people are capable of more than merely instrumental rationality and true freedom of choice. Germain Grisey, Joseph Boyle, and the late Olaf Tollefson make a powerful argument along precisely these lines. It's an argument against skepticism and the denial of free will in a book entitled Free Choice, a Self-Referential Argument. Now, they and I do not deny that emotion, feeling, desire figures in human action. Obviously it does, and on many occasions it or other subrational motivating factors will do the main work of motivation. But we hold that people can have, and often do have, and are fully aware that they have, basic reasons for their actions, reasons provided by ends they understand as aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, and desire precisely as such. And these ends, too, figure in motivation. It seems to me what the Humean, Hobbesian account of our practical thinking cannot account for is the fact that sometimes we want things precisely because we grasp their intelligible appeal. And were it not for our grasp of their intelligible appeal, the desire for them would not be present. Now, if I'm correct in affirming that human reason can identify human rights as genuine grounds of obligations to others, rights which people possess as a matter of natural law, sometimes called natural rights, how can we explain or understand widespread failures to recognize and respect human rights and other moral principles? There are some people who say doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but they say it, that they're puzzled at how there could possibly be an objective morality when we know that there's a diversity of views out there in the world about what the content of morality is. And my answer to that question is, and? The whole quest of philosophy, of moral philosophy, is undertaken, as Leo Strauss once pointed out, precisely because of our perception that there are a variety of views of what's morally right and wrong out there. And so what we want to do is think rigorously and clearly and with analytical precision about the problems so that we can identify what we think does and doesn't correspond to the truth of the matter. But in any event, I think we can give a perfectly reasonable account of the widespread failures to recognize and respect human rights and other moral principles. And the failure is one that will be familiar to anybody who recognizes that human beings, although capable of great intellectual feats, are imperfectly rational. We're rational animals, but we are very imperfectly rational animals. We're prone to making intellectual and moral mistakes and capable of behaving grossly unreasonably, especially when deflected by powerful emotions that run contrary to the demands of reasonableness. Even when following our consciences, as we're duty-bound to do, we can go wrong. A judgment made in good conscience may nevertheless be erroneous. Some of the greatest thinkers who ever lived failed to recognize, for example, the right to religious liberty, a true human right. Their failure, I believe, was rooted in a set of intellectual errors about what such a right presupposes and entails. Now, the people who made these errors were neither fools nor knaves. The errors were not obvious, and it was only with a great deal of reflection and debate that the matter was clarified to enable us to reach even the degree of agreement that we have now on the subject of the right to religious liberty. Ethics is hard. I mean, not all moral questions are hard, but a great many are hard. It's not easy. It's easy to go wrong. Of course, sometimes people fail to recognize and respect human rights because they have self-interested motives for doing so. In most cases of exploitation, for example, the fundamental failing is moral, not intellectual. Ordinarily, people who are exploiting other people know perfectly well that they're exploiting other people. But, they give in to the selfishness that causes them to do the exploitation. In some cases, though, intellectual and moral failures are closely connected. Selfishness, prejudice, partisanship, vanity, avarice, lust, ill will, and other moral delinquencies can, in some ways that are quite subtle, as we all know very well just from our own lives, impede sound ethical judgments, including judgments pertaining to human rights. We, imperfect human creatures, are all too capable of rationalizing bad behavior, cooking up really plausible sounding reasons for doing what we want to do, even though in our heart of hearts we know what we want to do just isn't right. Whole cultures or subcultures can be infected with moral failings and that blind large numbers of people to truths about justice and human rights. And ideologies that are hostile to these truths will almost always be both causes and effects of the failings. We can get up on very high moral horses about things that are actually wrong rather than right. Consider, for example, the case of slavery in the antebellum American South. The ideology of white supremacy was both a cause of many people's blindness to the wickedness of slavery and an effect of the exploitation and degradation of its victims. Let's turn now in a more focused way to the God question, the question of God and religious faith in natural law theory. Because an awful lot of people seem to think that the natural law position is a religious view. Now, it's certainly not hostile to religion, and many of the greatest natural law theorists have been religious believers. Today, some of the greatest natural law theorists are Jewish or Christian believers, and there's an element, especially in Shiite Islam, that is quite favorable, although the language of natural law is not used, to this very way of thinking. So most but not all natural law theorists are theists. They believe that the moral order, like every other order in human experience, the order of logic, the order of nature, the order of what Aristotle called techne, or the technical order, is what it is because God creates and sustains it as such. That's their account of why things are the way they are. In accounting for the intelligibility of the created order in all of its dimensions, not just the moral, they infer the existence of a free and creative intelligence. In other words, a personal God, nous. Indeed, they typically argue that God's creative free choice provides the only ultimately satisfactory account of the existence of the intelligibilities humans grasp in every domain of inquiry, including, for example, the logical order. Natural law theorists do not deny that God can reveal moral truths, and most believe that God has chosen to reveal many such truths. However, natural law theorists also affirm that many moral truths, including some that are revealed, can also be grasped by ethical reflection apart from revelation. They assert with St. Paul, letter to the Romans, chapter 2, that there is a law written on the hearts. This is a quotation from Paul, a law written on the hearts, even of the Gentiles who did not know the law of Moses, a law the knowledge of which is sufficient for moral accountability, and in Paul's view, even for judgment. So the basic norms against murder and theft, for example, though revealed in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are accessible and knowable even apart from God's special revelation. The natural law can be known by us, and we can conform our conduct to its terms by virtue of our natural human capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice. Now, the absence of a divine source of the natural law would be a puzzling thing, just as the absence of a divine source of any and every other intelligible order in human experience would be a puzzling thing. An atheist's puzzlement might well cause him to reconsider the idea that there's no divine source of the order we perceive and understand in the universe. But it's far less, I think, likely to cause someone to conclude that our perception is illusory or that our understanding is a sham, though that is certainly logically possible. I really believe that people who think that our perception is illusory and our understanding is a sham bring that as a matter of faith to the issue. The question then arises, can natural law, assuming that there are true principles of natural law, provide the basis for a shared understanding of human rights without consensus on the existence and nature of God or the role of God in human affairs? It's really a vital and pressing question, one that has been pressed by the current Pope, at least for the next couple of weeks, and by his predecessor, Pope John Paul II. In my view, and neither Pope has asked me, but in my view, anybody who acknowledges the human capacities for reason and freedom has good grounds for affirming human dignity and human rights. I don't care whether you're a Buddhist or Hindu, Sikh, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist. These grounds remain in place, whether or not one goes on to advert to the question, is there a divine source of the moral order whose tenets we discern in inquiry regarding natural law and natural rights? I happen to think, as I've said, that the answer to that question is yes, and that we should be open to the possibility that God has revealed himself in ways that reinforce and supplement what can be known by unaided reason, that God, as a person, is willing to enter into a relationship and desires a friendship with us. But we don't need agreement on the answer to the God question, so long as we agree about the truths that give rise to the question, namely that human beings possessing the godlike, awesome powers of reason and freedom are bearers of a profound dignity that is protected by certain human rights. Now, of course, we should not expect consensus. There are moral skeptics who deny that there are any moral truths. There are religious fideists of various faiths who hold that moral truths cannot be known apart from God's special revelation. And even among those who believe in natural law, there will be differences of opinion about its content and implications for certain issues, including some very important issues. To believe that there is a natural law just in itself doesn't tell you anything about what you should believe about any of the disputed questions about what is in line with and out of line with the natural law, with moral truth. So it is, I believe, our permanent condition to discuss and debate these issues both as a matter of abstract philosophy and as a matter of practical politics. I've elsewhere criticized certain inferences for political morality drawn by the late John Rawls from what he labeled the fact of reasonable pluralism. That is, the fact that you will have widespread disagreement, even about fundamental things, in circumstances of political and religious freedom. But, as critical as I have been at some of the inferences Rawls draws, I don't deny that what he calls the fact of reasonable pluralism is a fact. Rather, I affirm it as such. I think we should expect significant disagreement in circumstances of political and religious freedom. There are what Rawls calls burdens of judgment. Ethical questions can be difficult. In circumstances of political liberty, reasonable people of goodwill can be expected to develop divergent views, even about some profoundly important moral matters, extending even to questions of who is to count as a member of the human community, and as such someone to whom obligations of justice are due. The unborn, the newly born, seriously mentally disabled persons, elderly people suffering from severe dementias, Alzheimer's disease, and so forth. People obviously dispute those questions. It's sometimes regarded as an embarrassment to natural law thinking that some great ancient and medieval figures in the natural law tradition failed to recognize, and in even some cases denied, human rights that are affirmed by contemporary natural law theorists and even regarded as fundamental. Consider, for example, the basic human right to religious liberty, what the Constitution of the United States calls the right to the free exercise of religion. This right was not widely acknowledged in the past and was even denied by some prominent people in the tradition. They believed, wrongly in my view, that the robust conception of liberty in matters of faith presupposes religious relativism or indifferentism, or entails that religious vows are immoral or non-binding, or the comprehensive subservience of ecclesial communities to the state. In other words, they identified the whole idea of religious liberty with the sort of French Revolutionary idea, the laïcité idea of religious liberty. Now, it's interesting that when the Catholic Church put itself on record firmly in support of the right to religious liberty robustly conceived in the document Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, and this wasn't, of course, until the mid-1960s, so the Catholic Church is coming very late in the day to this robust conception of religious freedom, it presented in that document both a natural law argument, that's the first half of the document, and an argument from specifically theological sources in the second half. The natural law argument for religious freedom is founded on the obligation of each person to pursue the truth about religious matters and to live in conformity with his conscientious judgments. So the right is not some abstract free-floating thing that just comes out of nowhere. The right, rather, is grounded in the duty. The right to religious liberty is grounded in the duty of the human being to pursue the truth about religious matters and to live in conformity with his conscientious judgments of the truth. This obligation is in turn rooted in the proposition that religion, considered as conscientious truth-seeking regarding the ultimate sources of meaning and value, is a crucial element, one of the basic dimensions of human well-being and fulfillment, what I've been calling a basic human good. It is among the basic human goods that provide rational motivation for our choosing. The right to religious liberty follows then from the dignity of man as a conscientious truth seeker, hence the title of the document, Dignitatis Humanae, human dignity, the dignity of the human being. Now, of course, people who reject the natural law understanding of human dignity and human rights will differ from natural law theorists on questions of what constitutes progress and decline when it comes to morality. From a certain theological point of view, the type of religious freedom defended by contemporary natural law theorists will be regarded as licensing heresy and religious irresponsibility. Natural law ideas will be seen just as rhetorically toned-down forms of liberal secularism. You find this, for example, among some radical elements in Islam, some ultra-traditionalist elements within Catholicism, some of whom have been thrown out of Catholicism, and sometimes within certain fundamentalist forms of Protestantism. By contrast, from a certain liberal secularist point of view, natural law ideas about things like abortion and sexuality and other hot-button moral issues will be regarded as intolerant and oppressive, a philosophically gussied-up form of religious fundamentalism. In the end, natural law ideas, like theocratic ideas or secularist liberal ideas, will have to stand or fall on their own merits. Anyone who wonders whether they are sound or unsound We'll have to carefully consider and dispassionately think about the arguments offered in their support and the counter-arguments advanced by their critics. The last thing I want to do is consider with you the ways to give you a better understanding of what I think natural law theory actually is, so you can judge for yourself whether you're with this thing or not with this thing. I want to give you at least a basic sense of what the similarities and differences are between the natural law view and the main competing accounts. Those that don't simply do away with ethics the way the Humean, Hobbesian reduction of practical reason to purely instrumental purposes does. So let's look at how natural law theories are both like and unlike utilitarian and other consequentialist approaches to morality on the one hand, and Kantian, or so-called deontological approaches, on the other. Like utilitarian approaches, and unlike Kantian ones, natural law theories are fundamentally concerned with human well-being and fulfillment, and indeed take basic human goods as the starting points of ethical reflection. They reject, natural law theorists like utilitarians, reject the idea of abstract rights. For natural law theorists, duties and rights that correspond to duties are rooted in human goods. The well-being of human beings is fundamental. Natural law theorists are Aristotelians. Aristotle is, in a certain sense, the founding father. Unlike utilitarian approaches, however, natural law theorists understand the basic forms of human good, those fundamental elements of our well-being and fulfillment, as they figure in options for morally significant choosing, as incommensurable in ways that render senseless the utilitarian strategy of choosing the option that, overall and in the long run, promises to produce the net best proportion of benefit to harm, however benefit and harm may be understood. So natural law theorists think that the master principle of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, or do the act that will produce the net best proportion of benefit to harm, just doesn't make any sense. It's an incoherent principle because you cannot weigh and measure human goods in the way that you would have to be able to do to make that system workable, that norm workable. So natural law theorists share the Kantian rejection of aggregative accounts of morality that regard the achievement of sufficiently good consequences or the avoidance of sufficiently bad ones as justifying choices that would be excluded by application of moral principles in ordinary circumstances. Unlike Kantians, however, natural law theorists do not believe that moral norms can be identified and justified apart from a consideration of the integral directiveness of the principles of practical reason directing our human choices and actions toward what is humanly fulfilling, toward human flourishing, and away from what is contrary to it. Moral norms are rooted in the good of human beings. Natural law theorists do not believe, in other words, in purely deontological norms. Practical reasoning, moral reasoning, is reasoning about both the right and the good, and the two are connected. And let me say how. The content of the human good shapes the moral norms which are applied in judgments about right and wrong, and moral norms themselves are entailments of the primary practical principles that direct our basic choices toward human well-being and fulfillment, and whose integral directiveness is articulated in the master principle of morality and its specifications in morality's norms. And that master principle I would formulate along these lines: choose and act on those options, only those options, which are consistent with a will toward integral human fulfillment. So respect the human good in all persons, all the time. It's not something that you can bring about. There's no master plan for bringing about overall human fulfillment. You can't do that. The human good is too variegated. The instantiations of human good are unlimited. The possible instantiations of human goods are unlimited. But what we can do is respect the integral good of each person. Now, that's not to determine what the integral good of the person is. That's going to require argument. That's going to require debate, identification. But the norm is pretty clear. respect the good of all persons. Treat all persons with dignity. How do you treat a person with dignity? By respecting the goods in those persons. Now, such a view, of course, presupposes the possibility of free choice. That is, choosing that is the pure product neither of external forces nor internal but subrational motivating factors such as sheer desire. So a complete account of natural law will include an account of principles of practical reasoning, including moral norms as providing rational guidance for free choices, and a defense of free choice as a genuine possibility. Now, philosophers in the natural law tradition, going all the way back to our father Aristotle, have placed particular emphasis on the fact, or in any event what we take to be the fact, that by our choices and actions we not only alter states of affairs in the world external to us, but also at the same time determine ourselves for better or worse as persons with a certain character. So we believe, what I think most people of common sense believe, that our actions, goods and bads that we do, the good and bad things we do, don't just go out there into the world and have no further impact on us. They have a big impact on us. They shape our characters. They orient or reorient us dynamically in one direction or another. That's why you care about what your kids do. Sometimes you're not so much concerned about the wrong that they've done in one little particular case. You come home from the grocery store, you got little Sally, little Sally's 5 years old. You come home from the grocery store, you're putting the groceries out on the table, and you see little Sally pull out a Three Musketeers bar, and you know you didn't pay for the Three Musketeers bar. What do? Those of your moms, dads, you know what you do? Back in the car, to the store, with the Musketeers bar. You go up to the lady. Sally, do you have something to say to the lady? You give it back. Now, were you worried about the Three Musketeers bar? Do you think the store's going to go broke because Sally took the Three Musketeers bar? No. You want to teach Sally a lesson. You want to do moral education, and especially you're concerned about the impact on the child's character of the actions that she performs. So recognition of this self-shaping or intransitive quality of morally significant choosing leads, for those of us in the natural law camp, to a focus on virtues, something I have said very little about in this lecture, and you may have been wondering about that, on virtues as habits born of upright choosing that orient and dispose us to further upright choosing, especially in the face of temptations to behave immorally. So people sometimes ask, and I'll conclude with this, is natural law about rules or virtues? Ever heard that? So what kind of natural law? Are you a virtue theorist or are you a rules guy? And I have to confess, I find that question utterly baffling because the answer seems so obvious to me. It's that we're both. Natural law is both about rules and virtues. A complete theory of natural law identifies norms, rules, for distinguishing right from wrong, as well as habits or traits of character whose cultivation disposes us to choose in conformity with those norms, and thus compatibly with what we might call, borrowing a phrase from our old friend Kant, a good will. That is, a will toward integral human fulfillment. Thank you for your exemplary patience. I appreciate it.